Hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of Micro Lessons by the Container Brothers. I am Michael, the Senior Director of Products at Apprenda, and with me I have
Eric Loskarden, and I'm the Senior Solutions Engineer here at Apprenda.
Today we're going to be talking a little bit about continuous integration and continuous deployment, also known as CI/CD in with most of our customers. One of the biggest things and advantages of Apprenda is the fact that you can use our web interface, which is what we call the developer portal, that allows you to deploy, manage, scale all of your enterprise applications. So this is great if you're a developer and you're doing an ad hoc deployment of your application, or if you already have an app and you want to view some of the monitoring statistics, or you want to scale it, or any of those jobs. The problem here is that you're doing that as a one-off. That means it requires a person to go into the portal and take an action. A lot of the CI/CD systems, though, enable you to go through the entire end-to-end provisioning process for your application in an automatic way. And Apprenda supports a wide variety of CI/CD systems, starting from IBM UrbanCode Deploy, Team Foundation Server from Microsoft, as well as Jenkins. And what is important here is the fact that you can use any of these tools and attach them to your build process, your source control systems, as well as with a platform as a service like Apprenda to automate an end-to-end process where a developer makes some change to their code, they check that code into some kind of source control system, and then it kicks off an automated deployment process that installs their application into Apprenda. And we're going to show you some of that today to show you the power of Apprenda integrating with all of these systems.
Yeah, and Michael, one thing before we get started, this thing is very important because most organizations, especially as you move to higher lane environments like your UAT or your production environments, the act of deploying an application in production is not simply pushing your binaries to that environment. But most organizations, especially in those heavily regulated industries, have a whole set of policies and pipelines that an application deployment has to go through, from approval processes to potentially vulnerability scans on the source code before it gets deployed, to building, if you're leveraging things like containers as well, to building the container of your application. And integrating with a technology like Jenkins or UrbanCode Deploy or TFS allows you to basically also abstract all of those processes from the developers. Developers simply writing code, checking it in, and then this whole automated pipeline of going through all those steps get kicked off, and then you get continuous deployment of your application, but in a standardized and compliant way. And you're going to see a short demo of what that looks like, from a high level, very simple deployment, but customers set up multi-lane deployments and multi-stage and approval processes, and you can make it as compliant and as flexible as you need.
Absolutely, that's a very good point. And all of these choices provide flexibility to the developer, as well as they abstract all of the complexities from them. As a developer, you don't need to know about all those multi-jobs and concurrent tasks that happen. All you have to do is concentrate on writing your code, and then through some magic that happens, whether that's Jenkins or IBM UrbanCode Deploy or TFS, you get your application up and running on a cloud platform like Apprenda, and you can actually start initiating test runs, validation runs, or even go yourself and play with the application. For Jenkins in particular, we do have a landing page on Apprenda. So if you go to apprenda.com/partners integrations Jenkins CI, we have a link to a white paper. We have our GitHub page where we have complete source code that you can check out and possibly modify our Jenkins integration, as well as the ability to download the latest version. So let's go ahead now and get started. And we're going to look at Jenkins here. First thing we're going to do is open up the credentials object to show you what that looks like. And this is essentially an object that points back to Apprenda, giving us some details in terms of where does your Apprenda installation located, Are you using a self-signed certificate versus a code-signed certificate by GoDaddy or VeriSign? You give us some details about your credentials, like what tenant you belong to, what's your username and your password. That's all the details that Apprenda needs in order to be able to connect to that specific development team or that specific tenant in Apprenda and be able to upload and modify applications.
Yeah, and Michael, just before you continue, the credentials part is also important. In this case, you're seeing, Michael providing his own Apprenda credentials. In a lot of our enterprise deployments, what you end up seeing is customers create some sort of functional service account using single sign-on, and they leverage that for Jenkins for deployment. So this is an account that it's all responsibilities deploying applications. So you have, a lot of auditing and tracking around it, and integrated with single sign-on. You can use that account, or Jenkins can use that service account to connect to the platform and strictly deploy applications. But using Apprenda's role-based access control, then you can restrict access to everything else, but just the deployment process.
Exactly, and we give you the freedom to create as many credentials objects as you need in Jenkins to satisfy different teams or different tenants. Like Eric mentioned, if you have a functional account, that account will be a member of every tenant or of every development team you have on Apprenda. So you might need to templatize that a little bit so it will give you flexibility in terms of deploying one application using the same account to one tenant and then switching gears and deploying a different application to different tenant, again, using the same username and password. So let's go ahead and create a job here. And we support a variety of job projects here with Jenkins. You can create a freestyle project. We allow you to create a multi-job project. So anything that basically fits your needs, you're able to do that. In this case, let's go ahead and create a freestyle project. So I'm going to click OK here. And we're going to enter a couple of details, like this is a demo project for Jenkins. And for the vast majority of settings here in Jenkins, those are standard controls that you have in terms of influencing how the whole CI/CD pipeline will work. In our case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to build, and I'm going to go directly and add the deploy to Apprenda build step. Now, one of the things that happens here, and me and Eric were talking about this earlier, is that you can go ahead and add additional build steps like the execute Windows batch command or execute shell. And that gives you the ability to use tools like MS Build, right, Eric?
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. So, when you leverage a tool like Jenkins, there's all sorts of ways of doing it, or any sort of deployment mechanic, right? You can have your build process as part of the same pipeline or job that Michael is building, or and that would be adding, an MS Build if you're talking about .NET applications, or maybe you're adding a Maven build as part of this process, and then you package and deploy to Apprenda, which is what Michael's going to do. Or you can have another third-party system that's in charge of the source code management and the build and output artifacts, and you simply have Jenkins as a deployment and release management tool. So you can get very complex in your jobs. There's customers that then add previous or pre-build steps around source code and static code analysis and vulnerability scans using technologies like Black Duck or SonarQube, and you can get very complex and leverage all sorts of best of breed technologies to ensure that this is met and done in the right way. And then you incorporate things like approvals in between, right? So before it deploys to Apprenda, maybe you're going to run a series of tests as well. And then it's going to send a notification to an approver that needs to review the test before it gets pushed to production. So you can get it you can make it as complex as you need to fit your specific organization.
Absolutely, and and Apprenda does publish a command line executable called acs.exe that can be plugged into an MS Build batch command. And essentially, when MS Build finishes building your application, whether that's in this case specifically to Visual Studio and Windows applications, but it could be a Maven project that could build in a different language, then you can combine that with acs.exe to produce an Apprenda archive, which you can then feed into the deploy to Apprenda build step that we're going to talk about right now. So let's go ahead and enter some details here for the deploy to Apprenda build step. So the first thing is I'm going to select the credentials that we just looked at, and this is essentially telling me, go ahead and use these credentials and connect to Apprenda under that development team and deploy this application under that context. I'm going to give an alias here. I'm going to call it container bros, and I'm going to name my application name the container brothers. I'm going to let the version prefix PV. Essentially, this is the prefix that we put in Apprenda to before every version of your application. So it could be version 1, version 2, so it will be V1, V2, and so on and so forth. Now, I want my application to go into the sandbox stage. So essentially, this is our development and test stage, and you have a choice here to select definition, sandbox, or published, and Apprenda will equivalently apply the archive that you provide us to that application version. If you were using an MS Build task or a Maven task, essentially what you'll end up is with an artifact name, and this is the Apprenda archive. This is a zip file that has a very well-known structure of folders and files in it that depict what your application is comprised of. In this case, just to make this a little bit simpler, I'm going to use the application package URL, and I'm going to go to the Apprenda downloads here and copy the URL from the time card application that you publish and enter it here. And this is really all the details that you need to provide to Apprenda. Now, we do offer a couple of advanced settings, and I'm just going to go through them here just for viewing purposes. You can automatically create a new version each time that this build job gets executed, or you can actually even tell Apprenda to force the deployment of the application to a specific version. And remember that all of these settings do have a help attached to them. So if you're not sure what to do at any one of these steps, click on the help file and we'll give you some details on that. Or you can go back to our GitHub page and it has detailed step-by-step instructions, including some pictures on how to get everything done. So I'm going to go back and select none here, and I'm going to save this job. So now we have this project demo that will take the archive from our web download page and it will create a new application for it. So let's go ahead and click build now and see what that looks like. So Jenkins will now go ahead and create a job for this project, and I can click on it and I can see a few things. I can see the environment variables and see if there's any environment variables that were fed into this. You can see them here. And I can also see the real life console output. And here it's showing me that it went ahead and against the apps.dc1 Apprenda Labs environment, it authenticated me as Michael, and it started creating some of the application components for my Container Bros app, uploading the archive that I have provided to it, and then it's going to patch that application into the sandbox stage, which is what I define. That this process only takes less than a minute, but it's important here to note a couple of things here, and I want Eric to help me kind of provide that message, is that if you're using Jenkins to do your full end-to-end deployment process of your application, that's great. When you combine Jenkins plus Apprenda, you're getting a multitude of benefits. Eric, you want to help us itemize some of those big benefits here?
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. And that's a very, very important point, because when we go talk to a lot of organizations, you might get, development teams that say, well, we already have automation using Jenkins to deploy, so I don't understand why I also need Apprenda. And the answer, becomes very important, that the value from an Apprenda point of view is not only in the deployment. That is, of course, a huge value, right? Simplifying the deployment of an application. But think of normal day-to-day tasks that you would have to do, and what happens when some issues happen, for example, in the underlying infrastructure, right? If I had my Jenkins job targeting directly my servers, so I have maybe a Windows box or a Linux box or a collection of boxes, right? Deploying an application might require that I set up a template for 2 or 3 servers. I need to know server names. I need to configure a load balancer. patching an application, you then have to deal with things like deploying to all of the instances. What happens if one of the servers were to go down that's hosting your app, or you get a new server, you have to go through each one of your deployments and change the configuration, add a box or whatever it might be. With Apprenda, as you saw with Michael's demo, you simply provide your credentials to the environment and the name of the application. Whatever happens behind the scenes in the infrastructure is stuff that Apprenda as a developer is abstracting you from. So if there were upgrades happening behind the scenes to the infrastructure, you would never notice. You don't have to change your deployment script. If, let's say, there's a data center migration or a consolidation, or the IT team decided to add some hybrid cloud, some public cloud resources, your deployment process as a dev doesn't change at all, right? You don't have to learn how to deal with that. You don't need to learn how to deal with scaling in your jobs for Jenkins. You have to learn how to deal with high availability, with load balancing, with configuration of patching. It's all done through the same exact process, regardless of the technology, right? Michael's deploying here a .NET multi-tier application, but if you're deploying a Java app or you're deploying pods to Kubernetes, the plugin is exactly the same. The pipeline is exactly the same. And that's a very important benefit, right? Because it then allows you to leverage Jenkins for what it does best, or TFS or UrbanCode, whatever technology you're using, which is to build and provide that automation pipeline, but then let Apprenda handle the actual hosting and running of the application to then get all of the benefits of running in a modern cloud environment.
Yeah, absolutely, Eric. Thanks for clarifying that. That's a super powerful message. Apprenda provides a shared service that you can, as an IT organization, you can deliver to your developers, and every developer that comes and develops their applications on Apprenda immediately gets to inherit and take advantage of all our cloud capabilities, everything from high availability, auto scale, the shared service where you can deploy your applications and not have to worry about specifying infrastructure specific settings, but immediately you just give us an archive and you get back a URL for your app. All of those benefits are extended to a CI/CD platform here like Jenkins, so that the integration between Jenkins and Apprenda can leverage all of that. And like Eric mentioned, the fact that you can bring any type of application that's supported by Apprenda into a CI/CD system like Jenkins is money. That's exactly what developers want, and they get a single environment, a single development tool set that they get to use without having to learn something new, because there's always going to be newer technologies coming out there. And in this way, we're standardizing into a single set of tools, no matter the language or technology choice you make. So our Jenkins job here completed and everything was successful. So if I come into Apprenda and I refresh our screen here, we see our Container Brothers application. It's in Sandbox, and I can even go into that application and launch it. And I get to see the application in action. In this case, it's a simple time card application. So it's a time tracking .NET app, and basically it's hosted on the Apprenda Labs environment. So very simple. For a developer, all I did was answer a few choices into Apprenda, and then a couple of minutes later, I have my application up and running. It cannot get any simpler than that.
Michael, and one thing though that also, and maybe you were getting into it, the demo hides all of this complexity. This application that Michael just deployed is a multi-tier application. So there's a website, there's a web service, and there's a database. That all was deployed through this simple job. If you look at setting up, going back to the conversation that we just had, if you had to set up a deployment, and especially when you start talking about microservices applications where things get a lot more complex because you have more components, you saw in this case, this application got deployed. It was one step, the one package that was provided to Apprenda that understands those architectures. And it was all done automatically through this process. I don't have to set up individual pipelines, which maybe once you're moving to a cloud native environment and you're really build out microservices, you want to have those individual repositories. But it does allow you to have a much more flexible and easy to set up pipeline compared to if you had to set one up for your database, your website, your service, and this and other that, and deal with infrastructure level decisions for each one of them. All of that is handled by the Apprenda platform automatically.
Absolutely, good point, Eric. So now we completed our Apprenda job in Jenkins, and we can go ahead and version this application. We could modify that and configure that. So when changes happen, you can push your application to the publish stage or do version control and go to version 2 or version 3. But the important thing is that you can set up a CI/CD tool like Jenkins to automatically detect changes to your application. For example, a developer checked in a change overnight. It will take the code that the developer checked in, produce a new version of your application, and bring it into the dev and test stage in Apprenda, which is sandbox, and allow your test to happen. So this is more of an automated process. So every night, go ahead and get the latest version that was checked in of my application, push it into Apprenda automatically, and run your automated acceptance test against it. So a lot of flexibility and a lot of value from that. But one of the things that you'll see is that in this case, I created a single project for a single app. If you're an organization that has hundreds or thousands of applications, you can see how this is going to start creating a lot of jobs in Jenkins, which is making it harder for you to manage. So one of the advantages that we created into our Jenkins integration is the ability to parameterize and abstract into a template certain Apprenda specifics. So I'm going to go ahead and look at one such job that we parameterize here so I can show you what that looks like. So if you click on configuration here, one of the first things you notice is that it has clicked the option, this project is parameterized, and it provides parameters for some of the key Apprenda details that are needed to build your application. Everything from the folder path, the stage, the URL path for your Apprenda application, the file name, the application name, the alias. All of those are the details that are key specifics into your project. And then when you go to the Apprenda builds tab, we actually abstract them using $sign and then the name of what you chose. So in this case, I'm not putting static data into this job, but I allow the caller of the job to define what those parameters will look like, such that I can have a single job that will span one or more of the applications in my environment. So I'm going to go ahead and go back. I'm not going to save this, and I'm going to show you a couple of cool things. So the first thing we can do is we can actually, in Jenkins, when we're looking at this Apprenda job, which is a multi-job in this case, I can go ahead and say build with parameters. And the first thing that we get is we get a detailed listing here that asks us to enter details about each one of these parameters. And you can invoke that from another Jenkins jobs. So you have the option to do that, or you can invoke that directly. And we do have a job called the builder job that calls this job as a side effect. But in this case, for simplicity, we're going to go ahead and test this like this. So we're going to call this container bros 2, and our file name, I'm going to use the same file name from the downloads page here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the shortcut, come back to Jenkins. So I'm going to use a URL path instead of a file name, and then our alias is container bros 2 again, so I use the same alias. And then the stage, I'm going to put it to definition. And I'm going to go ahead and click build here. And what's going to happen is Apprenda, the integration through Jenkins, will pass all those parameters back into our plugin, and then it will invoke the plugin and start executing the jobs on Apprenda using the values you specified. So if we click on environment variables in this case, we're going to see a lot of these details that we just provided, like the alias, the stage, the URL path, the folder path, the application name. Everything that we defined into the parameterized build of Jenkins gets applied as environment variables and then fed into our plugin and then ultimately to Apprenda. So if we look at our console output, we saw that this was already accepted and the entire promotion was complete. So we can go back to the Apprenda dashboard and show you that we now have a brand new application called Container Bro 2 that's in definition and is ready to move through the lifecycle stages or Apprenda. And this is very powerful. So now I can create jobs in Jenkins that can span one or more applications for a development team, and it gives me the freedom to alter the input to those jobs based on the Apprenda environment I'm in, based on different settings of different applications, or based on results from an execution of a build environment, or like Eric mentioned earlier, maybe a code scan environment or something else. So Jenkins is very pluggable. It gives you options to build any type of application you want. And this Apprenda plugin is also offering you the same type of freedom to customize your CI/CD pipeline as you see fit in your organization. So with that, we'll offer you some closing thoughts. We think that CI/CD systems are basically here to stay. They are the best way to develop and deploy your applications into a cloud environment like Apprenda. It offers you the freedom. It abstracts a lot of the complexity that developers get to see. And it also gives you powerful plugins and powerful integrations to be able to do anything your organizations wants. Eric,
Yeah, and that's very important. And I think towards the end, Michael, aside from all of the developer benefits that you went through, from an organization and IT point of view, what building these sort of templates like Michael showed you gives your organization is that you now have a standardized deployment process for every application. So it's a perfect gateway to ensure now consistency into your application deployment and your environment. So regardless of the technology that you're deploying, whether it's, again, .NET, Java, containerized workloads, you now, as an IT offering this service, as an IT organization, you can now have a standardized pipeline that has all of the policies and controls that you need. And it's still a much quicker way for developers to go through this process and deploy their applications than if they had to do everything and learn how to wire things by hand. This is all automated. You can automate the process of building these templates via Apprenda. We have customers that do that through our add-on capability. So you can basically give developers a pipeline as a service. They'll click a button, they can get a source code repository with Jenkins or some other tool already wired in with the Apprenda plugin, and makes it very, very easy for developers to start checking in code and get that automated deployment into the Apprenda environment, whether it's dev, test, UAT, or prod, and get it all done in a consistent and standardized way.
Thank you, Eric. And thank you all for watching another instance of the Container Brothers. We look forward to seeing you guys at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.